Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel and to another video. In today's video, I'm going to be going over a little bit of an introduction into programming the Olympic or weightlifting movements and how you can start to program them into whatever activity or whatever exercise you're trying to do in the gym. So let's get right into it. So when we're looking at building a program, there's certain things that you may want to consider. So one of them could be filling an exercise bucket of need. So this is like an idea that is there anything that comprises the idea that like, is there anything that you need in order to achieve or complete an exercise? So whenever you're looking at, let's say like a clean and jerk or snatch, typically there is a front rack position involved, there's a squat, and there's an overhead motion. So when we're looking at performing these exercises, we may need to have stability within the overhead position. So we may look at, okay, are we strong enough within our upper body to maintain that position overhead? We also need to maintain our center mass throughout a range of motion and the exercise. So center mass could just be described one way as, our body weight, right? And then maintaining our center mass throughout the range of motion. So let's say you are completing the lift with a weighted implement. So as that weighted implement's moving closer and further away from our body, how are we able to essentially not lose our balance and fall over? So that is one way that we can describe maintaining our center of mass. And then can we execute the exercises at high velocities? Typically in the gym, you'll see more slower moving exercises. So the Olympic lifts are a great way to start introducing some higher velocity movements to our body so that we're a little bit more exposed to, faster speeds and can get us into more competitive sporting endeavors and everything. So, and then the last couple things that we may want to consider is the demands of the sport that you're trying to go into and the exercises on the body. So when we're trying to learn how to understand how to program for a desired adaptation to achieve a goal, there are certain things that we may want to look at. Let's say like how much force is being implemented onto our body, and how are we going to be able to tolerate those forces either through the movements and then progressing that towards whatever physical endeavor, say a sport or something that you may want to participate in. And then finally, taking into account your current exercise routine, whether that's been the one in the past that you've been using for X amount of time, and then trying to tailor exercises that make that transition a little bit easier to go into different movements. So when looking at the Olympic weightlifting movements, we also want to consider the stretch shortening cycle. So the stretch shortening cycle, abbreviated here as SSC, one way of thinking about it is could be described as like a biomechanical idea of a rapid stretch into a contraction of the muscle and the tendon after a powerful exercise or activity. Now, during this video, we won't be diving into like the neuro aspect with like the spinal cord and all that, but this will just serve more so as a brief intro as to why this cycle is important. So this can be characterized into three typical phases or contractions. We have a eccentric contraction, which can be described one way as the lengthening of a muscle tissue or the stretching of a tendon. The amortization or brief isometric phase where there's no change, and the concentric or potentially the shortening of a muscle tissue and the compression of a tendon. So oftentimes this stretch shortening cycle response occurs during fast movements or plyometric activities and can induce a large stimulus to the muscle based off of ground reaction time, the depth of a jump, or several other factors. So these are just some examples or illustrations or visuals. So when we're looking at like, let's say ground reaction force, this is important when we're looking at the ground contact time. So ground reaction force, think about like Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there's an opposing and equal action, right? To kind of maintain that neutral point. So ground reaction force can change depending on like the biomechanics of the exercise. But for this purpose, what we're looking at is jumping on and off of a box. So when you're jumping in the air after leaving like a higher point of contact, the tendons help to store elastic energy and the muscle can eccentrically control the body when landing from a jump. So if you look at the picture where my cursor is here, we have a tendon and we have the force coming downwards. So if you think about like your calf muscle, right? Your gastrocnemius, right? Typically what that muscle does is it does plantar flexion of the ankle, or when your toes point towards the ground. When you are leaving a jump, typically what happens is you need to be able to maintain some amount of dorsiflexion and then go into a stretch here, and then a rapid contraction in a plantar flexion so that you can leave the ground and go up into the air. So that force there is from the depth of how in gravity acting upon us is the depth from the jump, and then the sudden contact with the floor, and then that displacement is how much that tendon is, essentially being stretched and how much elastic potential energy that it is storing. So that is what like the displacement of that tendon here is. And then once we go into a contraction, we have that rapid stretch into a contraction. We're able to propel ourselves off the ground. And this gets into like the ground reaction forces. So when we're looking at ground reaction forces and Newton's third law, it's important to consider this because it helps us to estimate how much force is going through that tendon or muscle so we can see how much force we need to tolerate to perform a certain action, right? Now you can dive into the weeds of how much forces are being, how much forces we need to tolerate through sport and everything else. But one thing that we want to just implement is we just need to understand that, that plyometric activities induce a high level of stress to the body, and being able to accommodate and tolerate those stresses can be important and can be beneficial when returning to sporting activities. So these two visuals just kind of briefly go over what we talked about. So we have the stretch shortening cycle, eccentric or lengthening or a potential lengthening of the tissue, amortization, a brief isometric phase, and then a concentric. So the shortening or the amortization phase, or time spent between contractions, is beneficial. Shortening that phase is beneficial with generating power because it helps us, power can be described as like energy over time. So if we're able to decrease the amount of time that we are spent on the ground, it can help us to obviously produce more power. So implementation, why is the stretch shortening cycle important? And TE being triple extension, why are these important, and how can thinking about Olympic lifts be important going into these two types of things and into different exercises? So triple extension typically involves the simultaneous contraction or extension of the hip, the knee, and the ankle when it goes into plantar flexion. So when you're performing a clean and jerk or snatch, typical or triple extension is typically required to help push the bar upwards and then into the overhead extension or into the overhead position. So you'll typically see the knees are straightened out, the hips are pushed forward, and the toes are the closest ones to the ground relative to like the ankle. So this is what we would call a triple extension through the lower extremities. The stretch shortening cycle is typically used during the dip and the drive up from the squat, typically under load, and when we're trying to rapidly stretch and contract to maintain our upright position. So if we can leverage the adaptations that we get from a stored elastic potential energy from the tendon and the rapid amortization phases from the muscle, this can help us with force output and exercise efficiency when we're performing the Olympic lifts. Now, obviously, over time, as we perform these exercises, we will get better at them because exercise, one way of thinking about it, can be just like a skill, right? But as we're doing this, we receive the adaptations from the stretch shortening cycle and other factors to help us perform these exercises as well. So a little bit of insight into the snatch, and these same concepts can be applied to the clean and jerk. So we have the first pull, the transition, the second pull, and like the turnover, as this graph would illustrate. So when we are looking at the transition between the triple extension during the second pull, we see that during the second pull, and going into like that turnover, we require lots of power through triple extension in order to accomplish this movement. So we need to make sure that the hips are pushed forward to a certain degree, the knees are extended, and then our toes are lower to the ground relative to our ankles, so that we can achieve that triple extension. Large amounts of power are usually produced um, over shorter periods of time with performing this motion. And being able to produce larger forces over time can help us to lift more weight, be more efficient with our exercises, and produce more power so that we're stronger and we're faster. So when we're looking at implementing these, there are certain methods to begin implementing, and these are some ways that we can start to program it. So when building a program and implementing the Olympic lifts, it's important to recognize the adaptations that we want to achieve. We want to be able to achieve rapid stretch shortening cycle. We want to be able to achieve high power output. And we want to be able to achieve some level of exercise efficiency so that we can do these exercises well enough so that we can achieve those adaptations. So when we're looking at, let's say, storing that elastic potential energy within the tendon, we are able to build some level of tendon stiffness so that a stiffer tendon can help us to produce more force, and it can tolerate more force so that when we are put under pressure, right, those forces are able to be distributed and we can tolerate them much better and lead us to reduce risk of injury. So we want to be able to build tendon stiffness, and we want to be able to build power generation and recognize the strength capacities to perform these motions. So the Olympic lifts are another great way of building these adaptations. So for individuals building a program, they may want to incorporate the Olympic lifts to improve, let's say, like our sprints, because it's a powerful exercise. There's an energy component and a time component. There's a triple extension component due to, if you look at like the biomechanics of a sprint, and a rapid stretch shortening cycle through the lower extremity, like during gait phases, right? So like if you are going for a sprint, typically a sprint could be described as 1 foot on the ground at a time. You need to have a certain level of force tolerance through that calf muscle and through the entire lower extremity to be able to handle the forces going from an eccentric to a rapid concentric out of those muscles so that we can maintain our sprints. So we want to be able to build a strong foundation. However, we can also implement ways that don't require a stretch shortening cycle right away to initiate potential entry points to these exercises. So that sounds like a lot. So let's get into how, like a sample day and ways that we can regress and progress these exercises. So we're looking at like a depth jump, right? If you were to jump off the ground right back up into the air, you would require that stretch shortening cycle. One way that we can do that is by limiting the depth to that jump. We can either decrease the height of the box, or we can just practice stationary jumps. That helps us get into a little bit more triple extension without the demand from jumping from a box. Here I program 3 sets of 5. You can program whatever you desire, but this could be a good starting point. A power clean. Now this is similar to a full clean. A full clean would demonstrate us getting ourselves into that front rack position, but then transition down all the way or dip down into a squat, like a full squat, and then back up. So this would be where the individual or somebody would catch the bar in a higher posture or stance. So if I would program here maybe 3 to 5 sets of 5. This is just a good way to start building some technical efficiency within the movement. So now I have the front squat, a great way to build up the upper back, the lower extremity, and it helps to mimic the front rack position during the snatch or during the catch of a clean and jerk. So I would program here maybe 3 sets, 4 to 6 reps, depending on where you are in your programming, to maybe like an RP 7 to 8, right? Making sure our intensity is there. And then more so for our like accessory, we have a leg extension. This can help build the force tolerance and capacity within the quadriceps. Going a little bit higher in the rep range here, again, dependent on where you are in your programming. This could be 2 to 3 sets, 10 to 15 reps to a high intensity. So in summary, when we're looking at programming the Olympic lifts, they can be beneficial with looking to create whatever adaptations that we want to achieve with regards to power and force output. They are also beneficial to mimicking triple extension mechanisms seen in like many sports. So let's say like basketball, soccer, track and field, like those kind of sports, you see a lot of presentations of triple extension within those sports, and we may need to be able to mimic those joint angles and produce a lot of force to be successful in those sports. Developing power is also beneficial to decreasing or increasing force over time, just the simple power energy over time equation, and also reducing the risk of falls. Because if we're able to catch ourselves, we might have quicker reaction times, and it reduces the likelihood of us falling and then potentially sustaining injury. So now with this being said, mechanics are important to consider. However, they are not the only thing to consider when you're running a program. Training in general is a stress. It's a physical stress, mental stress. It's just a big stress alongside everything else that you do in and outside the gym. So when you're programming, it's important to be considerate of these factors outside of just the exercises being done, and just be flexible and adaptable when it is needed in your programming. So these are just some references. If you guys have any questions, thank you guys for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. But yeah, thank you guys for watching, and here's to getting strong. Thank you.